Tim Dillon was a closeted homosexual, failed child actor that got addicted to cocaine at the age of 12. Raised primarily by his schizophrenic mother, Tim Dillon thought it a good idea to purchase a $500,000 home in Long Island at the age of 22 during the peak of the housing bubble. Fast forward to 2022, and Tim Dillon's podcast, The Tim Dillon Show, is the second most popular podcast on all of Patreon, earning more than $200,000 per month.
Kelly, we got one!
He has nearly 500,000 subscribers on YouTube and just recently released an hour-long stand-up special on Netflix. Clearly, Tim Dillon is doing pretty well for himself these days. But how did he turn things around? Tim Dillon started doing stand-up comedy in 2010 at the age of 25. This was also the year that he came out of the closet and the year that he decided to get sober, so for Tim this must have been a pivotal year. Regardless of that, it would still be some years before Tim saw major success. He continued to hone his stand-up skills at open mics and took on a day job as a New York City tour guide on a double-decker bus. He even did some guest appearances on smaller podcasts throughout the years, but it wasn't until 2016 that Tim Dillon really started to make a name for himself. In 2016, Tim Dillon was named one of the new faces of comedy at Montreal's Just for Laughs festival. If you don't know, that's a pretty big deal in the world of stand-up. That means that Tim had been making big waves in the comedy scene leading up to the summer of 2016. One of the things he was doing that got some attention was a podcast he started in August 2015 alongside co-host Mike Racine. This podcast, called Stewed, was short-lived with only 16 episodes, but hosting a podcast alongside a more established comedian like Mike Racine allowed Tim to showcase his talent to a potential audience. The final episode of Stewed released in May of 2016, and Tim was scheduled to perform at the Just for Laughs festival at the end of July. What better way to capitalize on that opportunity than by starting a new podcast?
Now, Tim Dillon is going to hell!
The Tim Dillon Show, originally called Tim Dillon is Going to Hell, launched on July 14th, 2016. The show was co-hosted by Ray Kump, who would stay with the show for the first 145 episodes. Although it certainly was a comedy show, the subject matter tended to focus around discussion of the wealthy elites and conspiracy theories, which gave it a unique twist compared to other New York City podcasts. At launch, the podcast was hosted on Gas Digital Network. Gas Digital is a podcast service created by New York City podcasters Louis J. Gomez and Ralph Sutton, and essentially it's just a service where people can pay a monthly subscription fee to gain access to a collection of several podcasts. This was probably good for Tim Dillon is Going to Hell starting out because it meant that the show would instantly be promoted to the existing Gas Digital subscriber base. The Patreon page for The Tim Dillon Show wasn't created until August 2019, and Gas Digital doesn't make their subscriber count public, so it's hard to determine exactly how much growth in listenership Tim Dillon experienced during his first 3 years. Looking at Google Trends over this period of time for the search term Tim Dillon, we can see that Tim's popularity was mostly stable aside from a notable spike early on in September 2016 and another in August 2018. That first spike is probably from a combination of appearances Tim Dillon made on Robert Kelly's You Know What Dude, as well as Fox News' Red Eye around that time. The spike in August 2018 coincides perfectly with Tim's appearance on Bert Kreischer's Bertcast, which was probably Tim's biggest guest appearance up to that date. But then in February 2019, there was a huge spike in people searching for Tim Dillon. And you can see that whatever it is that happened here permanently altered the trajectory of Tim Dillon's career. So what did happen?
How are you, man?
Good.
What's going on?
How are you?
Good to see you. Thanks
for
having
me.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
Yeah.
On February 22nd, 2019, Tim Dillon made his first appearance on The Joe Rogan Experience. This exposed Tim to the largest podcast audience in the world and undoubtedly gave him a tremendous boost in popularity. Since then, Tim has appeared on Joe Rogan's podcast 10 more times. If we place each of these appearances on the Google Trends graph, we can see that Tim Dillon gets a huge surge in search frequency each time he appears on Joe Rogan. Anyway, in the summer of 2019, Tim Dillon moved from New York City to Los Angeles, parted ways with Gas Digital and with his co-host Ray Kump, and changed the name of the show from Tim Dillon is Going to Hell to The Tim Dillon Show. It was also around this time that Tim started posting video recordings of each episode to YouTube, which usually featured the new producer for the show, Ben Avery, as a second mic, although he didn't talk much. The Patreon page for the show was launched on August 16th, 2019. Remember, this was a few months after Tim's first appearance on the Joe Rogan Experience, so he already had some major momentum and a decent base of listeners. So it should come as no surprise that the Tim Dillon Show gained almost 750 subscribers within 2 weeks of launching on Patreon. With each patron paying $5 or more each month to receive weekly bonus episodes and access to the now archived first 145 episodes of the show, Tim Dillon was earning over $4,000 per month through Patreon in his first month. In a little more than a year after the Patreon launch, the show was earning over $50,000 in monthly donations, and that number doubled to more than $100,000 per month after another 6 months. By the end of January 2022, after roughly 2.5 years on Patreon, the Tim Dillon Show was earning a whopping $200,000 each month in donations. Looking at the Tim Dillon Show's Patreon growth over time, it's actually pretty difficult to identify key moments that caused the growth rate to increase because nearly the whole graph shows a gradually increasing rate of growth. I would have expected to be able to identify some spikes coinciding with Joe Rogan appearances or other key moments, but nope, growth rate seemed to just steadily increase ever so slightly as time went on. But actually, this makes perfect sense. Even before launching the Patreon, Tim Dillon's work ethic has been relentless. I know I'm missing some, but by my count, Tim Dillon made at least 12 guest appearances on other popular podcasts in 2019, 25 guest appearances in 2020, and another 17 guest appearances in 2021. But again, I'm definitely undercounting. In any given week, Tim Dillon might be appearing on another podcast with millions of listeners. This is what the pig does. He serves up slop. So it makes sense that the Patreon graph is devoid of any dramatic spikes. Tim Dillon never lets up. Or does he? Clearly, the Tim Dillon Show's rate of growth on Patreon has slowed down starting sometime in late 2021. In fact, it seems to have more or less flatlined starting in May 2022. So what's going on? Well, as far as I can tell, Tim hasn't slowed down much in his output. He did make only 1 appearance on the Joe Rogan Experience in 2022 as opposed to 3 appearances in 2021 and 5 in 2020. But my best guess as to why growth has stagnated recently is simply saturation. Aside from his 11 appearances on the largest podcast in the world, Tim Dillon has been a guest on pretty much all of the biggest comedy podcasts in both the Los Angeles and New York City scenes, and his stand-up has been featured on Comedy Central and Netflix. I mean, Tim is pretty mainstream by this point. I think it is very possible that Tim Dillon has already captured the entirety of his potential audience. Like, if you're a person that likes listening to comedy podcasts, you've almost definitely heard at least 1 or 2 Tim Dillon rants by now. Another possibility is that the quality of the Tim Dillon Show has gone down, causing fewer new listeners to convert to Patreon patrons. I've looked around a bit on Tim's subreddit and in the YouTube comment section, and I see mostly supportive comments, so I don't think this is it, but who knows. Either way, I don't think we need to be worried about Tim Dillon's livelihood. Even if he lost 90% of his income overnight, he'd still be earning more than $20,000 per month through donations alone. Tim Dillon is gonna be alright. By the way, if you enjoyed this video, this one right here is what you're going to want to watch next. Click on it.